today. My role here is to introduce you to Pete, for Pete to read, for Pete and I to have a conversation, which we hope y'all will join in. So I'll begin with the introductions. Pete, who I've only met once in my life before in the basically the transom of Square Books. A quick handshake, and then he was off down the road, which seemed a metaphor that was apt for a guy who's written a book about traveling the South. But I'm glad to spend actual time with you, and I look forward to our conversation. So Pete is a writer, he's a photographer, and he's a lapsed academic. And he may talk a little about and he also publishes on his Substack, to which I subscribe and I recommend to y'all, called The Detourist. He's native of Atlanta, and that figures large in this book. He lives in Asheville, North Carolina with his family. His book is a righteous plumbing of suppressed family histories, a vigorous exorcism of the myths and willful ignorance that trouble the South. He blazes a path through the nostalgia thicket. We'll come back later to talk about nostalgia. He blazes a path through the nostalgia thicket for readers who want to make sense of their inheritances. Pete writes with indignation at times in this book, and he writes with empathy at all times in this book, showing us a better way to see the South so that we can better love any place we call home. So Pete, if I remember our plan, you're going to read a little bit, but you might begin with whatever you wish before you read.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And it is great to finally see, hang out in person. We live such virtual existences. But I told John T. that meeting John T. Edge on the transom of Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi is like the most cliched Oxford story ever, but it's true. It actually happened.
Indeed.
And speaking of bookstores, the best job I ever had was working for minimum wage in the magazine section at Oxford Bookstore in Atlanta, Georgia, back in the mid-90s. And Oxford was, to me, like a safe harbor in an often dark and a dreary world. And it was one of these institutions passionately devoted to books. And at one point during their history, they stayed open until 2 in the morning, and it was not uncommon for people to go out on the town and end up at Oxford Books. And Oxford is no more, but Square Books is here, and this is an institution I have the same kind of reverence for, and it really is such an honor to be here. So thanks to you all for coming out. I thought I would read just a little bit that, since it's a bookstore crowd, about how one particular book really shaped this whole story, and how a book can really transform a life. Let me see, where was that? Here we go. So during one of these tours that the book describes in 2018, we ended up on the very last day on the grounds of the state capitol in Atlanta, which is a building I had been to maybe as a child, but never really explored very much. So pick up here on the grounds of the Capitol. The Capitol grounds are shaded with native trees, southern magnolia, pecan, live oak, but there is less shade than there used to be. After an infestation of starlings came to roost in the 1960s, then Secretary of State Ben Fortson waged a protracted and mostly unsuccessful war against the birds with tin cans, shotguns, flares, and Roman candles. He lost, and so did 3 huge magnolias that Fortson had removed. Like the Confederate monument in Tuskegee, the dozen or so monuments to Georgia's political past on the Capitol grounds are more exposed now. When we were here in 1997, the entrance on Washington Street had been guarded by a statue of, quote, the fiery agrarian Senator Thomas E. Watson, as the WPA Guide to Georgia puts it. with an upraised fist and an attitude of forensic vehemence. The WPA Guide to Atlanta, published 2 years after the State Guide, interestingly, and perhaps characteristically, softens forensic vehemence to oratorical eloquence. Whatever the attitude, the message seems to have been, get the hell off my lawn. In 2013, Watson himself was removed from the lawn, turned 180 degrees, and set in a park across the street, so that now the incendiary agrarian populace raises his fist towards the Capitol itself, not as its gatekeeper, but as its benighted exile. There is a certain kind of Southern mythologist who reveres Watson as the model of the protective, gun-toting father figure who would sooner cold-cock a Yankee industrialist than see his maidenly agrarian South outraged by unwanted advances upon her virginal purity. Watson was also a racist firebrand who became increasingly hostile towards African Americans over the course of his 40-year career in politics. In 1913, he wrote, "In the South, we have to lynch him occasionally and flog him now and then to keep him from blaspheming the Almighty by his conduct on account of his smell and color." Even if that were the only such comment he had ever made about the matter, it would be enough to question the wisdom of the statue of Watson in front of the entrance to the state capitol. But Watson had his own newspaper, the Jeffersonian, in which he fumed prolifically about the evils of Jews, Catholics, black people, and Coca-Cola. He used it to stoke populist anger against Leo Frank, a Jewish businessman who in 1915 was awaiting a death sentence in the state pen in Milledgeville for the murder of Mary Fagan, a white woman. When Frank's sentence was ultimately commuted to life in prison, a mob of white men, prodded on partly by Watson's editorials, lynched Frank on the town square in Marietta in August 1915. But for every main gateway, there is a service entrance. At the northeast corner of the building, facing the intersection of Capitol Avenue and the boulevard named for him, there is a new statue of Martin Luther King Jr. in a quiet corner of the Capitol grounds. Like Joseph Brown on the other side of the building, overcoat draped over one arm, he clutches not the Bible, but documents in the prosaic form of a folder full of papers. The monument is barely a year old. The front of the Capitol is for white people who supposedly made history, but the backside is the black section. A few steps away from the new MLK statue is another monument to African American history in Georgia. Titled "Expelled Because of Color," the 1976 sculpture by John Riddle tells the story of African American experience in Georgia, from images of slavery to the ballot box. The title is a reference to an event in state history that I am hearing about for the first time. During Reconstruction in Georgia, dozens of newly enfranchised African Americans were seated in the state legislature and thereby given hitherto unknown political power. White resistance kicked in. 33 African American legislators were kicked out of the Capitol on the unsurprisingly spurious grounds that their eligibility to hold office was not established by law. The real reason, of course, is obvious. It's an episode that did not make it into my education. I had to go around back, seek it out. In Black Reconstruction in America, W.B. Du Bois describes the episode. Led by a white Democratic senator, quote, "A movement was started to declare that since Negroes were not citizens, they could not hold office. The motion was eventually struck from the record, but the damage was done. Shortly thereafter, the push to have African American members removed from the Senate and House succeeded. The white Democratic senator who led the movement, Milton A. Candler. My great-great-grandfather's oldest brother, Milton Candler, represented the 5th Congressional District of Georgia in the United States House of Representatives from 1875 to 1879, the same seat that John Lewis held over a century later. Milton was a Democrat, but not like Lewis. In the late 19th century, the party was dramatically different than it is today. It largely represented the white elites and acted acted as a main engine of resistance against the new enfranchisement of African Americans during Reconstruction. I know nothing of Milton's personal political views, but I have a decent idea. Nothing of his story has been passed down to me through family lore. If any of my forebears know anything about Milt, they aren't telling. I didn't know about Milt at all when John Lewis came to speak at our high school. I only knew slightly more about Lewis, but not much. I knew that he had marched in Selma. I knew that he upset Julian Bond in the Democratic runoff in 1986, and then won easily in the general election. But what I remember from the time he was running for Congress is that his opponents criticized Lewis for the way he talked. He lacked the stately rhetorical polish of Bond. It was not difficult to see even then the thinly veiled racism behind those criticisms. But when Lewis came to speak to us, I sensed that something was different from the standard dispensation of important information at the weekly Tuesday assembly. He didn't have to come talk to us, and had little to gain by doing so. He knew so much more than he could share with us in 50 minutes. One subject I'm sure he knew more about than I did was Milton Candler. Okay, so thanks for coming. cheerful beginning.
Well, it does, it's a great place to start a conversation. It also begs an explanation for the book, too, I think. Because you mentioned multiple time frames and trips. And I think this might be a good juncture to talk to them about the structure for this book, the way this book works.
So the book actually begins in 1997. That's when it really started. And it had something to do with the fact that Oxford Bookstore went bankrupt that summer. And it was in the context of a rapidly changing landscape in Atlanta, and things were just, I talk about Alex Barbecue, which I'm sure you know a great deal about, and that was also a very famous institution in Atlanta in the West End that also went under around the same time. So out of a desire to sort of see what was left of the South, that my friend John Hayes and I from high school and college were reading about in Flannery O'Connor in college, about this whole world that it was the South, but it was not Atlanta. And out of a sense of curiosity, we decided one summer to just hit the road in we were young, so John had a 1977 Ford pickup with no air conditioning, and we thought it'd be a good idea to hit the road in August to South Georgia with no map, no GPS or anything like that, and no cell phones, and just kind of follow the road. We knew that we wanted to get to New Orleans and back, but how we were going to get there was a mystery. So that was the first of a number of tours that we did up until about 2004, and then we took a long break, and then to make a long story short, we revived the tours in 2018 in a very different cultural context when Confederate monuments were sort of on the front page every day. It was after the Charleston massacre a few years before. And suddenly these questions of white supremacy and race and all of that was just unavoidable. And certain objects that I think we had just taken for granted as part of the landscape, for example, the famous white pencil here in Oxford, and so many others, it just sort of, wow, I mean, they're there, they've always been there. And never really interrogated their origin, and until these questions really became live for me in around 2017, 2018. And so that began a second set of journeys starting in that year. And suddenly I think I was seeing, I think I was much more aware now of what wasn't there on the landscape. I mean, the the episodes in history that were not marked. And as I just read, in the meantime, I had begun to learn about my own family history, which was sort of completely unknown to me. I mean, it was reduced to a few, I described them also like clue characters. I knew like Colonel Mustard or whatever. So that there were these like the judge and the bishop. But that was really all I knew. So that's where so these basically two sets of trips are kind of constantly conversing with one another throughout the course of the book.
So they're the two trips, and then they're the two explorations, one deep into family and one deep into the South. And you weave them together in this book. And one of the things I admire is that you embrace that weave, and you really present this as shards and fragments of a story. And in that weave, you help us understand the connections between those shards and fragments. And that's a gutsy thing for a writer to do. It either works or it doesn't work. And you made it work.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't know how you are when you write books. I certainly had no idea where this was going, and that was part of the logic of these trips. It was just, you sort of follow this logic of the road, and fortunately, I think it comes together somehow.
I'm going to quote a piece from you, because I like this idea. Speaking of that idea of fragments, you wrote, "It's better to tell a story in many true fragments than to tell an all-encompassing story that is false." And so I'd like you to expound upon that. Like, what is the problem with the all-encompassing story? And there's some people in the audience here who know that, already know the answer. They've already scored on that test. But
Can you tell me what the answer is?
But would you talk about that idea? Because I think it's operative for this book.
Well, I think, first of all, there is a certain kind of hubris in telling an all-encompassing story to begin with. I mean, none of us can presume to tell a story about everything.
Or a story about the South.
Or even a story about the South that is all-encompassing. And I think the legacy of the Lost Cause movement has been to present generations of white people with the illusion that there is one story to the South, and it equals, these 4 years basically of Northern aggression, and then all of the implications from that. So, for one thing, there's a problem with telling or attempting to tell an all-encompassing story, because it presumes a certain perspective that none of us have. That none of us have access to the perspective that would give us a view of the whole. The second reason, I guess, is a narrative coherence is usually something that comes about as a result of reflection. I don't think most of us experience life on a daily basis with a sense of kind of narrative cohesion. We experience life as sort of a series of fragments. And then the effort to kind of put them together is, I think, important. But it's always provisional and always, and I guess this is my background in theology may be revealing itself a little bit too, that even though theology was thought of as a sort of form of knowledge that's about everything, there is more truth in what we don't say, or what we let's just talk about the language about God. Here's a good quote from St. Augustine, who said that if you understand it, it's not God. So, so there's this idea within the discipline of theology about that sort of unknowing is an important aspect, and the presumption of a universal perspective is an illusion. Was that the right answer? Did I not hear it?
I think it was the right answer. And it speaks, though, to this idea that you're trying real hard, though, to know in this book. You're trying real hard to know things about your family that your family has suppressed. you're trying to know things about the South that your people have suppressed. And so, I was reading the acknowledgments of your book, trying to figure out, was I there? Who's there? And there was a name of a friend in common we have, Peggy Gallus in Athens, Georgia. A number of people in this audience know her. And I texted her to say, I'll see Pete today. And she said to me, she said, he has stepped up to tell the stories that's been hard for his family to hear. So I'll talk about that because this book, Pete's name, Candler, means something pretty profound in Atlanta. It means wealth, power, Coca-Cola. And you're telling stories about that family that challenge that family's sense of self in a way. And so, for a lot of us, there are writers in this audience thinking about writing about their own family. Talk to us about how that has been either gratifying for you or challenging for you or exactly what you expected.
It's definitely, I'm not really sure what I expected, but by the way, shout out to Peggy Gallus, who I love that we have that connection because, she is a true force, and she and my mom were roommates in college, and she's my sort of unofficial godmother, and one of those people who just generates friendship and a model for me. But I don't really know what I expected. I think I probably entered into this a little naively, maybe, but it felt like an inescapable responsibility once I began to encounter some of these. It all began with a friend of mine who used to run the Center for Study of the American South at Chapel Hill, who told me about this book about the lynching of Sam Hose in 1899, and he says, by the way, your family comes up in it a lot. And I was not expecting that, and so when I finally, read the book, it was eye-opening. And I think the amazing thing for me was that my family in the early 20th century they were on the front page of the Atlanta newspapers every day. It was, my great-great-grandfather was a Supreme Court justice. His brother was a bishop, a state Supreme Court justice. And his brother was a Methodist bishop. His older brother ran the Coca-Cola company. And then Milton, who I've already mentioned. And that whole generation was just like overachievers. But, so this was all over the place. It was public knowledge. But by the time of my dad's generation, and certainly by my generation, this was not ever discussed. It was not part of the sort of dinner table conversation. And which to me really spoke to the depth of intentional psychological labor dedicated to not discussing matters that were public knowledge. It takes a lot of work to not talk about things that everybody else knows about. And so when I was teaching at a university in Texas, a colleague came up to me once and he said, he kind of pulls me aside and whispers in my ear, he goes, it's like as if he's afraid somebody's going to hear it. Candler. He's like, I know what that name means. Well, maybe you can explain it to me because I'm still trying to figure it out. And so this weird sense of like, there are other people out there who know more about this stuff than I do or anybody in my family does. So, on the one hand, it felt really kind of oddly liberating to learn some of this stuff. And that's what I said about like the true fragments, as opposed to the false universal story. It felt, freeing, because at least I had some knowledge of the reality of these people as as human beings with some virtues maybe, and definitely some vices, and and also just to unburden myself of this weird sort of like silence thing around the Candler family. It's just so weird, and it's just like to just be able to sort of let go of that.
And if you brought up the specific incident of the lynching with Sam Hose, whom you talked about a moment ago, like, is there a moment when you bring this back up at your family? You're sitting at the kitchen table and you say, "Why didn't anybody tell me about this?" Do you have a moment like that? Was it more of a slow boil?
It was kind of a slow boil. And honestly, when I first shared this stuff with, like, my dad, his generation, like my dad and his older sister, there was this amazing sort of receptivity to it. I was really surprised by like the openness to, like, I had no idea about this. This is kind of a huge surprise. In the meantime, like, I don't want to sort of throw my sort of generation of cousins and stuff under the bus, but like, I don't know why, but that's the same sort of like curiosity doesn't seem to have, and I'm not sure what that's all about, but it is, at least, maybe there's just even less connection to the past.
Are you saying you introduced your father to this
Yeah,
story?
he'd never heard any of this stuff. I mean, that's just one. I mean, there are a bunch more that were completely new. Let me give you one example of how, like, this regime of silence, that I call it in the book, is no respecter of positive or negative stories. It just annihilates them all. And so my great-great-grandfather I mentioned was his first cousin was governor of Georgia during the Sam Hose lynching. And then John Slaughter Candler, the judge, as I knew him, was a colonel of a regiment of state militia that was sent down to Noonan to protect the peace during the lynching. And that the story, it's grotesque and it's deeply disturbing. But he was sent down to protect white people's property. Because the build-up to this was Sam Hose was on the run for like 2 weeks until he was finally captured. But so he went on to I'm doing some research about John Slaughter Candler, my great-great-grandfather, the judge, and I come across this little bit in there's the New York Times from 1883, and there's another one in the Chicago Tribune about this young, aspiring attorney who has just had this fatal accident on a train platform in Decatur, Georgia. He's fallen off the train platform. Something happened. Both of his legs has been severed, and he's a goner. And this was definitely news to me. But then, as an illustration of the importance of local news, local newspapers, a reporter from the Savannah Morning News went to visit him in the hospital where he was recuperating, and he hadn't died, of course, and he was recovering. As a good Methodist, he said, I probably would have been completely healed by now if I never said the word darn. That's what we're dealing with here. So anyway, but I'm going in my head. I'm like, okay, so wait a second. This guy, like my great-great-grandfather, had no legs, like, or at least his feet were severed. I'd never heard this story before. Like, how does that? I mean, I understand why the Sam Hose thing doesn't ever come up at the dinner table, right. But how has the fact that, like, my direct ancestor had no feet, like, ever? How does that not ever come? I mean, that seems like a kind of remarkable tidbit. And because I've seen pictures of this guy, like, he went on to this prominent career as a state Supreme Court justice. And he was then a lawyer for the Coca-Cola company, and like had all, and it's pictures of him standing, you would never know. And so it just illustrated that this regime of silence was like, it completely annihilated access to all of that. And as the sort of, maybe curious, but maybe it could be, maybe this is part of the explanation, but then I began to ask myself, well, so why, he was 21 at the time, 21, 22, why is the New York Times writing about this guy, this kid from Decatur, he's like just graduated law school, like, what's that all about? And then, as I later learned that the judge, as a young lawyer, was the chief of staff for Alexander H. Stephens when he was governor of Georgia, which only lasted about 4 months. But you may know Alexander H. Stephens from his more sort of notorious career as the vice president of the Confederate States of America, and as the author and deliverer of this speech called the Cornerstone Speech, in which he defined white supremacy as the cornerstone of this new government, so unambiguously associating the Confederate sort of project with white supremacy. So the judge worked for him, and so that presumably is why he was in the newspaper. But again, this was all. I mean, it's all out there. It wasn't like in some secret trove of documents. It was all in the newspaper.
So, I was thinking about this book. Every book's got an antagonist. There's some friction to be had. Somebody to chafe up against, something to chafe up against. And I was thinking about your book. Your book is erasure is one of the antagonists, and nostalgia for a simpler South, a better South, a simpler, better South for a white Southerner seems an antagonist in this book. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about the perils of nostalgia as you see it, having dug into your family and dug into the stories of the South.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be like totally nerdy for a second, if you don't mind. So back when I was teaching like Homer, the Odyssey, do y'all remember the Odyssey? It was one of those books you were supposed to have read. Like, so if you haven't read it, I'm going to give away the ending. So Odysseus is like trying to get back home after being gone for 20 years from his home. And the Greek term for the journey home is nostos.
Yeah.
That's where we get the word nostalgia from the Greek, from nostos, journey home. And whatever is going on in Odysseus' mind as he's sailing, across the Aegean back to Ithaca, when he gets home, it is chaos. I mean, it is like not what I think he probably was hoping for. It's like his wife, like all of these dudes are like trying to angle for his wife's attention, and it doesn't end well for any of them. Let's leave it at that. So anyway, like even the kind of sort of etymology, when I was thinking about the term nostalgia, it's almost like a parable. Home is not what you expect it to be. So even the idea of nostalgia or a yearning for the past or an idealized sort of past, is a yearning for some sort of self-comforting illusion. And so nostalgia, it seems like there's always some sort of psychological motive underneath the nostalgia, the desire for what you imagine as a pristine period. And I would say like this is actually a very live subject in our contemporary sort of set of circumstances, culturally and politically, sort of pining for a world, a time that was, when we were great or whatever. In my own case, like my family, I remember a dinner where a member of my family was talking about how, we were Irish and we'd come from Ireland, and It was our version of the Nostal, sort of our motherland. And again, like, well, it turns out we did kind of come to the New World from Ireland. We only got to Ireland because there was an ancestor who was a colonel in Oliver Cromwell's army. So it's like, this is the worst kind of Irish, which is to say, English. When I heard that, I was like, I don't ever tell my actual Irish friends anymore that, like, oh yeah, we have roots in Ireland, so bad idea. So yeah, they basically were the oppressors who came and like took other people's land. So yeah, I think there's another anecdote that I just heard the other day. You may know this, but someone was telling me about an ancestor who worked on the restoration of the painting at the Cyclorama. Do you know the Cyclorama in Atlanta? It's this, back in the 19th century, it's a fashion for these huge panoramic paintings, enormous. I mean, it's really impressive. So there was a period when they went to, I don't know the dates, but it must have been around the 20s or 20s, I'm guessing. And they retouched the painting in a way to make it, to sort of conform to the surviving Confederates' memories of this battle of Atlanta. And it wasn't, the interesting thing once from a psychological perspective was it wasn't, their memories were did not at all correspond to the reality of what happened, like documented what happened at this battle. They were repainting the cyclorama in the image of the memory, of the way they wanted to remember what happened. And that's what nostalgia really is. It has to do with a desire, a deep sort of psychological need to remember the past in a certain way. And so it seems superficial, but it's actually quite a profound sort of motive.
And that brings me to one more question I want to ask, and we'll open it up to y'all. I think about photographs and your use of photographs, and at some point in this book, I'm almost positive you quote Natasha Trethewey. I really admire, I know many of y'all read the book Memorial Drive, Natasha's memoir, in part about the death of her mother and her attempts to reconcile and reconnect. But Natasha does an amazing job in that book of seeing into photographs, around photographs, seeing what is not in photographs. And they're real prompts for her, for memories and for recollections. And I wonder for you as someone, so for those of you who haven't already picked up a copy of the book, when you start thumbing through, you'll see that Pete's photographs are here in the book as well. So for someone who not only you use photographs as prompts for writing in this book too, for recreating scenes from the past, but you're also an active participant as a photographer, taking photographs of these places about which you write. And so I wonder how that process of making photographs figures into your intellectual processes for writing.
That's a great question. I mean, like most things, I think I also entered into photography kind of I thought it was fun, it was cool. And back when I started taking pictures, it was all film, so it was just, it was only later that I came to really appreciate the nature of film as a medium, but also photography as an art form. And it was through the process of writing this book when I went back and I had all these, thousands of negatives from the first, 5 tours that were just sitting in in a case somewhere. And so when I went back, it was like seeing them, not for the first time, but revisiting them or re-seeing them in a way that was like revelatory. I was seeing things that I didn't even see when I was looking through the viewfinder. And I think that's what's so beautiful about photography is that I don't think capture is the right word for, it's a word we use about taking a photograph, but I don't think it's the right word, because a photograph does sort of freeze maybe a particular moment in time, but only in order to kind of reveal like the infinite density of any particular moment in human existence. So when you go back to look at a photograph, you can like see things that you didn't see the first time, and to me it's like it shows a world that, not just an image, but a world that is constantly revealing itself.
It's like that quote from Roland Barthes: "Cameras are clocks for seeing," which helps you get to the place you're headed.
Yeah.
I started out talking about the fragments of your book, and I want to leave y'all, at least from my part of this conversation, we'll move into y'all's, with two things to entice you to buy this book. Because one of the great things Pete has done here, and that's our purpose here, let's be honest, I want y'all to buy his book, so does Square Books, because I want authors to be successful. But these fragments that Pete has assembled in this book are not restricted to the things he's finding out about his family. There are these beautiful shards of life in the South that come cropping up in this book, and I want to share two of them with you because I found them the most interesting. One is that when you read deep into this book, you'll find out that Harry Crews, y'all know his books Feast of Snakes, you know his great book Childhood Biography of a Place. Harry Crews, kind of the grit lit writer of the South. Harry Crews used to hang out in Marjorie Kennan Rawlings' house after the University of Florida acquired it. He partied there with friends, and they called it the 12 Oaks Bath and Tennis Club. I love that. Like, this guy's brain, however he pulled that, I have no idea. The other thing that's darker and just as interesting that I did not know is that Harold Ross, the founder of The New Yorker, worked as a reporter for the Atlanta Constitution, where he covered the Mary Fagan murder at the Pencil Company and the lynching of Leo Frank. The shards of this book that this gentleman collects quite well tell their own deep and profound stories. And it's been a pleasure to spend time with your book, and I hope we'll encourage our friends to ask smart questions of a smart guy. So they don't have to be smart questions. They can be any kind of question. Yes, Charles in the back. You go first. Charles.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I enjoyed listening to it. Regarding the regime of silence, what you described sounds very common in households where there's domestic violence. That everybody knows what goes on in the house, and it's terrible and it's horrible, and there's a silent agreement. Nobody has talked about this, that once you leave the house, you never say anything about it. And I think what motivates that is a lot of different things. So my question is, what do you think motivates it? Is it amnesia? Is it shame? Is it horror that I come from this bloodline? I mean, if you had to, what do you think causes that?
Could y'all hear her question in the back? Okay, good.
That is a really good question. Yeah, the parallels with domestic violence are very interesting, and I think as a species of trauma, I think that's probably the word that covers all of these things. There are different causes. I mean, I've encountered regimes of silence among some black families for very different reasons. And some, I met someone the other day who's of Armenian ancestry, who lives in Asheville and has a similar sort of legacy of silence in her own family about Armenian genocide. And there are reasons not to talk about some of these things. especially if you descend from the victims of these crimes. And, you know, so it could be simply that it's just too painful, you know, to revisit some of these stories.
Or perhaps survival.
Or to survive, yeah. I mean, in the case of my acquaintance I just met who's from Romania, that it was totally about survival and not telling these stories in order to start over, like, you know, make new ones in the new world. And that's a common theme among refugees of genocide and that sort of thing. But in my own case, you know, it belongs to a different kind of phenomenon, I think, as if not necessarily perpetrators of like mob violence, certainly the enablers of a culture, and the, you know, in some ways kind of like the architects of a culture that that make this sort of thing possible, not only possible but justifiable. And you know, we have a common friend in Michael Twitty, who's, I think, probably also a hero of both of ours. I learned from reading Michael Twitty's book, The Cooking Gene, about the, you know, I was talking earlier about the sort of psychological and intellectual or mental labor that goes into suppressing these stories or maintaining that regime of silence, or not talking about your family history. What I learned from Michael was this sort of passionate need to understand his own family history. And it required him to go through all kinds of documents. And the documents that often marked the end of this journey were receipts for the sale of his ancestors. And beyond that there was nothing. There was nothing recorded. And it made me realize, like, almost with a sense of shame, yeah, that how much I took for granted that my own family's history is documented, so that I never had, like, to not talk about it, or not even care about it, not even be bothered by it, or even curious about it, was like the definition of privilege. To be untroubled by your own history because you know somebody else did that work. I could go find it in the Emory Library or whatever if I needed to, but it wasn't sort of it became an existential sort of urgency for me after reading Michael's book, and just kind of just being sort of blown away by, like, this search, because he goes on kind of a similar journey in search of his own origins, that, you know, you cannot take this stuff for granted. And I think it's, yeah, so.
Thank you.
That's a lot more to say probably about that question, but I should really think about it first.
It's such an elegant, hard question.
It really is, yeah.
Thank you.
Charles, did you?
My question is about how the book looked when you first began. Because the idea of the road and travel and a journey and all of this, is this the book you intended to write, or was there a real discovery in the process of doing the book?
Definitely the latter. It's definitely a process of discovery. And I think the idea of the road that animates this book is not just a metaphor. I think it's almost like a mode of existence. There's a reason why, for example, the theme of the road. I mean, it's like in my previous book, the photography collection, I talk about this a little bit. The idea of metaphor of the road, it's like one of the most basic forms of, it's not even human, it's like pre-human technology. That it's so basic and it seems so intuitive that you don't even think about it. We don't give much thought to the idea of a road. Well, how else would you get from this place to that one, besides like a path? And yet, as a metaphor, it's one of the richest metaphors throughout, like, the history of Western philosophy and theology. That it goes from Plato to St. Augustine to St. Thomas Aquinas. This idea of Dante, you know, the idea of the road as a mode of existence, or being on a road, on a via, you know, a wayfarer is like, or a pilgrim. These are all terms from, like, my own religious tradition, and the way of ways of describing human existence as being on the way or on the road. And so being on the road requires you, especially if you don't have GPS or even maps, you don't have access to that, like we were talking about, the perspective, the sort of the 30,000-foot perspective. It's actually quite, again, it's scary maybe, but it's sort of liberating to just give yourself over to this weird logic of American roads. And I think it's like, it's strange, and it's going to sound totally kooky maybe to you, but there are a number of episodes in this book that I could never have predicted, I could not have made up if I wanted to. One of them involves Patrick Weems, who's here, and an episode that took us throughout the Delta one afternoon. And that was like, honestly, the greatest fiction writer could not make this stuff up. And it's simply because that was one of many episodes where not having a sense of certainty or not having a sort of pre-planned, giving out a sense of control maybe was actually quite revealing. Once you do that, I talk about these like genie souls of the American roadside, which I stole from, I think I stole it from Walker Percy, and then I think I totally butchered it, but he's not here, so. So anyway, yeah, I'm not sure what I imagined when I started writing this book, but I think this is probably better than what I could have imagined.
We have another question out there? Lynn Roberts.
So, I'm interested when you shared what you found out with your family, and you said that your parents' generation, they were actually quite interested, but you said your cousins, were they not interested? Did they not care? Or did they just want to be like, I don't want to hear this, it's bad?
It's hard to say. I don't know. They haven't told me. It's like this weird sort of Southern thing where everybody's like really proud of you, but doesn't really want. It's so great that you've done the book, but like doesn't want to know too much, or maybe even read it, which is fine. Whatever. I don't know. It's strange, but it's like, knowing what I know about kind of my family dynamic, it's really not that surprising. And it's just maybe the way in which this, I think it just speaks to I'll give you one example that came from last night, because we had the launch last night in Atlanta. And, much of my family were there, and my brother was there. He lives in New Orleans, and he came up for the thing. He was talking to one of my family members afterwards, and the only comment she had was, Matt, my brother's name, Matt, you and Pete both need to shave. Like, facial hair does not look good. So, great Candler family's talent for diversion. Like, just change the subject. And I think it manifests itself in a lot of ways. There's also the kind of response that's like, oh, your book was, I didn't, there were so many new words, or I had to use a dictionary I didn't understand. Move on. I don't know. I mean, with like my cousins, I mean, we're just, I think we're probably all just in very different places, and that's fine. The book will be there. So.
This book ends in part. It ends a couple of times, and it ends. Pardon?
It begins with an.
It does, but part of it is taking your son out on the road, and that's my wife here in the audience can attest. That's one of the ways I've connected with our son. That side by side in the car is kind of confessional, father and son on the road, much is revealed in those moments. And I wondered if I don't know, what does the road promise for the future of your relationship with your children?
Well, first of all, it takes a certain kind of temperament to be able to go on a trip like this. I mean, my wife does not have that temperament. She would not enjoy these kinds of trips because she's very sort of organized, and I'm not. But Charlie is of that temperament, and he's a very visual person, and as it turns out, a great photographer, and so he's got a real beautiful eye. And I think ultimately this book was written for Charlie and his three brothers, and that was who I had in mind when I wrote this book. I wanted them to be less burdened, by whatever the kind of baggage I have, and to be able to see things a little more clearly than I've been able to. And I actually feel really good about their generation. I mean, for one thing, one of the things that helped me get over this whole Candler family thing, I mean, it's just, that's so ridiculous, but it's just like, was the fact that my third son, Oliver, came to me one day, and he's just like really curious about these people. Like, tell me about the judge, and he's like getting interested. He's like, well, they did some interesting stuff, and he just approaches them without the same kind of like layers of meaning or whatever it is. They're just people that I mean, that will kind of develop, but I found that really encouraging, and as I was trying to write about this stuff, to just sort of like let some of this stuff go. I mean, it's just like, it's not. They're just, they are just people at the end of the day that I happen to share a name and DNA and a legacy and all that stuff with, but like, don't overdo it. And I think that's like, my family's been really good at like overdoing it in terms of like maybe the strategy has been like preserve a family legacy or whatever by not ever talking about it. I don't know, but yeah, it's every chance I get to do one of those trips, Charlie's the one who will. The other ones don't really have the patience. They're too like, where's Wendy's? They're but Charlie's very chill, and he's actually the one who's campaigning now for us to do like a whole family Deeper South tour, which will be a disaster.
That seems an appropriate place to conclude, because this has not been a disaster. It's been a pleasure to listen to you, Pete, and to learn more about your book. So thank you.